What I thought I'd do on this talk is just give you my sense of what's going on in nuclear. And it's a little bit a combination of technology things which you've probably seen before or are well aware of, but also some of the policy implications and what's going on in the field. Okay. Apparently we will not have a presentation.
I think you just click on the slides. Put the mouse there.
There you go.
Okay. All right, so I'm starting the premise of my talk is that we do want energy, right? That it makes our lives better. This is the example I like to use, right? In some parts of the world, this is how people clean their clothes, right? And it is hard and it's backbreaking and it typically falls on the females of society and it prevents opportunity. Where we have energy, we've built ourselves modern conveniences that make our lives a lot easier. And so I think going forward in the future, people will aspire to this. And that's my premise. I don't think that people are going to start wanting to give up things like this. Okay? And it's not just washing machines. I mean, washing machines are critical, right? Because other than getting married, getting a washing machine is the other happiest moment of your life. I will argue forever. But it's everything, right? It's water purification and sanitation, and irrigation, all these things, right, that makes our lives convenient. But I will say over time, though, we get more demanding, right? We are insisting that these energy sources are cleaner, that they are affordable, they're continually affordable, that they're resilient, right? They're there all the time, or when they go away, they come back quickly. And I would say in the last few years or so, the conversation about that they're equitable is really becoming more important, right? That the risks and benefits of providing energy are distributed better, right? So that's the context, that overall energy context that nuclear sits in. But it's also changing in a very significant way. So, you know, on the left-hand side, right, that diagram is sort of how we made electricity when I was in high school. It was a very simple system. We had big central station power plants, and they made electricity, and they sent it out over transmission and distribution wires to people. Now, right, because we're using a lot of variable sources like solar and wind for their zero carbon benefits, it's making the system more complicated. Right, because we have to balance things that come on and off the grid, right? We're using things like demand response, where we're asking people to voluntarily allow their power to be turned down in some cases. And so in the 1960s, we incentivized nuclear plants to be built very, very large, right? We actually reimbursed them in a regulated utility model based on their size. So we built bigger and bigger and more complicated plants to make electricity. Now we have this opportunity to still do big electricity, but we can do local electricity. We can do direct electricity to businesses. I just saw an article today or yesterday about a big company in Vermont that was trying to get around the local utility system so they could just purchase their own, essentially create your own utility. There's opportunities for decarbonizing industry, right, and providing direct heat to industry. So the world has changed, so there's a lot more places or functions or business models where you can produce and provide energy. And nuclear is sort of filling into that new world. I will caution against believing people who think they're super smart, right? There's a long history of people who think that their thing is the thing, right? And the only thing that will work, right? The nuclear's version is Lewis Strauss. He was a commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission, and he's known for this quote about energy too cheap to meter. And I've heard this quote lots of times over the course of my career. It's normally somebody who doesn't like nuclear going, "Hey, too cheap to meter. Is that still working out for you?" But if you read the entire quote, it's really kind of over the top, right? And it's like, no more regional famines, travel effortlessly over the seas, minimum danger, great speeds, long lives, zero disease. There's a lot to put on a technology, right? But it turns out that this is not a unique function of nuclear engineers. Right? Doing a little history, I found William Stanley Jennings, who is a 19th century British economist who loved coal as much as Strauss loved nuclear, right? And it's not the exact words, but it's the same sentiment, right? It's essentially, we will never find anything better than coal ever again, right? We're going to have miraculous powers. There is no better source, right? And of course, hundreds of years later, we could argue that the use of coal did improve lives to a point, but that it's sort of the cost benefit use of coal is changing, right? That we're finding better, cleaner ways to make electricity to produce energy, and sort of phasing out coal to a great extent. I happen to pick out Paul Krugman because he's a Nobel Prize economist, right? But it's a similar tone, right? It's basically, we don't need to do any more technology development ever again because renewables are cheap and we're done, right? We're there, everything can be done this way, there's no problem, it's easy, and of course it's not, right? So my first argument was that we will continue to want clean, affordable, equitable, and resilient energy. And the second is, I don't think it's possible to do that with a single technology, right? That I'm a systems kind of person, and that I think that's what we're trying to fit into. All right, so that's what I think the context is, right? So what does nuclear technology look like? And hopefully you've seen a lot of this part before. But here's the brief history of nuclear. We started building commercial power plants around the 1960s. Major part of the building came in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? We were building about 30 plants per decade for roughly 3 years. Okay, so we've proven in the past you can build big, large light water reactors at a fairly good clip. But at some point it plateaued, right? Somewhere around the early 90s or so. And it was around 100 plants, slightly less than 100 now. But I mean, this curve looks a lot like a typical S curve for product placement, right? People get excited about your product, they build a lot, and eventually you reach some limit. And that limit is possibly you've reached what the technology can do, where it can provide value. The cost doesn't make sense anymore. It could be a policy driver has changed, right? How we value a technology, and it could be social license. How willing are people to use and have that technology in the community? So some combination of those four factors, we plateaued off at about 20% of the US electricity. Over that time period, we got a lot better at running the plants, right? And so I've seen this thumb rule that we've added the equivalent of 30 plants over 30 years just by operating them better, right? So even though there was electricity growth, demand growth during that time, we stayed at around 20%. So we're at this point now where some of those original light water reactors are shutting down. And there's a question about, are we at a cliff, all right? Are they going to shut down and we're done with nuclear forever? Are we at an inflection point, right? Where you bring in a new generation of products? And if it is an inflection point, what might that look like? And what's the combination of new technologies, cost of those, the public policy approaches around them, and the social acceptance that may decide whether you're at a inflection point, whether you're at a cliff, right? And so in that context, what's happening with existing reactors? Well, we're trying to run them as long as we can. The original licenses were for 40 years. A large fraction of them have been extended to 60. Some of them are going for 80. It wouldn't surprise me at some point if somebody tries to run them for 100. As long as they can make the case to the safety regulator that their material condition is acceptable and they can make a profit, they can keep running. You'll see that the plants that are challenged financially tend to be in deregulated markets, right? So even though we encouraged everyone to build these very large electricity producing plants, in some places now we don't value that in the way that we price electricity, right? And you're competing with cheap natural gas, ever increasingly cheap renewables, sometimes subsidies or preference on the grid through portfolio standards for the renewables, right? And in some cases, especially where it's a single light water reactor where you can't benefit from sharing staff across plants, they haven't been able to keep going. Some states are providing financial incentives similar to what you get with renewables. They're called zero ZECs, zero carbon credits, zero emission credits. Thank you. Right, to give you some credit for the fact that you are not putting carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere. Connecticut's done that. Illinois has done that. New York has done that, for example. The other thing that is very interesting to me is some of these are starting to put their toe in the water as to alternative business products. So 3 plants in the US have pilot projects with the Department of Energy to make hydrogen, right? So imagining a world where we need hydrogen for fuel cells or for turbines or airplane fuel, or you name the list of things where people think hydrogen may be used. Some of these plants are saying, during those times of day when I can't make a profit selling electricity, I will try to make hydrogen. So you start to see these demos. So I'd say with light water reactors, it's keep operating them more and more efficiently, extend their lives as long as you can, and in some cases, look at alternative products, right, that fit into that sort of complicated energy grid that I mentioned before. And this is a notional grant that I borrowed from INL, but people are thinking about where could you use nuclear steam, and you can think of direct support to chemical industries like plastic plants, hydrogen I mentioned, greenhouses, maybe in locales where you need to build, grow agriculture during winter months. I've seen MOUs with data centers, right, where you're going to provide electricity for heavy use data centers, or Bitcoin mining. That's my favorite, right? I don't understand it, but like apparently it takes a lot of electricity, and you can either get super rich or like totally take it. So, right, so lots of things that people are thinking about that we could use plants for. In parallel, we suddenly around 10 years ago, I would say, we recognized the emergence of what I like to think of as entrepreneurial nuclear. So for most of my career, right, the advancements in nuclear technology, I think, were kind of assumed that the research enterprise, right, university national labs, sort of develop things, and at some point they would get far enough along that an industrial concern would pick them up and take them commercial, and it never happened. Right? I mean, it's never actually spun off another commercial product. Well, in parallel to that, suddenly you've got lots of people, and at one point we tried to count them up, and depending on how you want to count them, it's on the order of 50-ish. But privately funded companies that I think they have the next nuclear product that's going to go to market. Some of them more advanced than others, some of them more famous than others, right? I think Bill Gates is the most famous because Bill Gates is Bill Gates, right? But there's lots of them, right? And they're all sort of marching hopefully towards commercial deployment. And what's interesting, we tend to have this tendency as technologists to talk about them in terms of, well, they're molten salt reactors and they're gas reactors and they're sodium reactors. I actually don't think that's very interesting. The fact that they're cooled by sodium does not make them a more useful product, right? So what's interesting to me more is the business applications or the deployment functions, the things they want to do, right? And so in that case, I'll say there's sort of two primary innovations. So one is this idea of modularity, right? So instead of large on-site construction projects that take 5 years in China and 10+ years in the US or Europe, the idea is you build these out in modules, you deliver them to the site, you minimize on-site construction. By building modules in a factory, you get better at it, like any manufacturing process, and you drive the cost curves down. There's other perceived advantages to this business model. One is you buy as many modules as you want, right? So you can add them with growth. You can get the plant started with the first module. So your goal, maybe you want 12, right? But you can put the first one in, start selling electricity or whatever your energy product is, and slowly build it up. You never have to shut down the plant this way, right? Because you can refuel module by module. So there's lots of potential business innovations in the idea of modularity, right? And I think this is one big difference that some of these companies are looking at exploiting. The other, I think, is in terms of size, this idea of micro reactors. So this is something that's on the order of 100th or 1,000th the size of a big light water reactor. And the initial places I hear people talk about these are remote areas, northern Canada, Alaska, places that the price point for energy is higher. This will give you clean year-round power delivery. But you also hear it in terms of a military basis for secure power or for mobile power that might eliminate supply chain issues. You can extrapolate mentally to think about maybe community scale microgrids, right? Where you're using a small nuclear reactor as an energy source. So this is a very, very different business model than the 1960s deployment. Right? It actually throws it on its head and says there'll be certain applications where this will make more sense, or it's proposed that this will make more sense, right? They've got to make it affordable. Some of the initial deployment opportunities are looking for places at a higher price point, right, where you may be able to get into the market. But if you build lots of these, right, like with modularity argument, you'll bring the price down, right, by building more and more copies of the same version. Now, we'll talk a little bit about social acceptance later, right? You're insinuating in this, right, that you will be able to deploy these in very, very different ways, right? So I've heard about, one example, radiant power. When I heard them give a talk, it was, I want to use their microreactor as the basis for charging stations along like interstate highways, right? So you can drive your car or your truck up and you need to plug in for a while. That it would make more sense to have a series of those along the highway than running a lot more transmission lines or putting a utility scale solar farm next to the gas station, electric station, whatever we're going to call it. Right? So, but that assumes that people are going to be happy with a nuclear reactor every 50 miles down the highway, right? I mean, there are these really big questions about security and social acceptance that get beyond the technology part of this, right? I think we, the nuclear technical community, do a ton on improving the technology. I don't really worry about that very much. And I think in regulatory space, we're asking the regulator to look at new concepts, but I think we'll sort of push our way through that. I think where we traditionally have not thought a lot, and where I think a lot of the interesting possibilities are more on the business cases and the public policy approaches around that and how you help make these things possible. Right? I think that's where we don't pay enough attention. And I think it comes out of this model of expecting the national lab system to push the next nuclear product, because hire a bunch of researchers, you'll get research-focused solutions, right? You'll get better technology, right? But I can tell you right now, I trained as a researcher. Am I good at starting a business? I'm not. I would be the wrong person to hire for that, right? And we just have to recognize that, sort of what skills we have. Okay. So why do I think people are even having a conversation about a next generation of nuclear? I think there's sort of four main imperatives. I think the biggest one is climate change and emissions reductions. I think the fact that people are starting to recognize that we have to do something about the amount of carbon that we're putting in the air brings people back into the conversation that might have not been willing before. And this is just lots of different news articles that shows different groups and who's interested. But I like to use the example. This is data from Ontario, because it shows like in practice, when somebody makes a decision to change their energy, where do they go? So the question was, can we shut down all the coal plants in Ontario and do it over about a decade? And they did, right? And they were very successful at that. And so if you compare the graph on the left and the graph on the right, where I've got coal still and I've got rid of it, you see, in order to get there, you needed this huge nuclear component as part of this change, right? And if it's just one example. If you want to look at who's decarbonized in the world, it's typically countries that have a large component of nuclear or hydro. So I think climate change brings a lot of people into the discussion. I think the second one I'll call supply chain, right? I mean, there's lots of people who believe that you cannot have a zero carbon future without nuclear. And if that's going to happen, then they should be the ones making money off of this transition, right? And there's estimates that this could be, a $1 trillion market, right? So I think for some people, it's, I want to be part of it, right? It's very business oriented, but I think that does bring people into the discussion about nuclear and where they might fit. The next one I'll call the security imperative. I think the argument goes something like, if there's going to be nuclear in the world, we would like to have some influence over the security and safety norms around it. How can you do that? Well, you'll need to be one of the vendors selling things, right? If no one's buying your product, and if the product is made by another country other than you, it's very hard to have as serious an influence over how the technology is used, right? So I think for some, there is this interest in ensuring that there's US leadership that goes beyond just, we should make money if there's an opportunity, and we should contribute to zero carbon into, we want to ensure that the way that the technology is used is as safe and secure as possible, right? So I think that's an argument. And right now, you've probably seen this before, 2/3 of the reactors under construction in the world are Chinese or Russian origin, right? We have gotten out of being the lead in deploying reactors around the world. We were in the 1950s, right? But we're not anymore. And the question is, with all these new SMR technologies, microreactors, et cetera, are we at a point where we can take the lead again, recognizing that the international markets will not necessarily demand a whole bunch of big light water reactors, right? In some places, that's more than a country needs. The last imperative I'll say is the resilience imperative, which is no one wants their electricity to go off. And when it does, you want it to come back on soon, right? You don't want to be Texas in the spring of 2020?
What?
2021. Okay, that's only been a year. And the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is a quasi-governmental agency that's sort of tasked with providing guidance, right, on how to maintain resilience in your system, has warned about reliance on single technologies. Right? If you build a system that all of the energy is produced in a single way, right? Let's say it's all gas, right? But you don't have sufficient pipelines, right? Or the pipelines will lower their pressure during the winter and people are not able to heat their houses, then you don't have a resilient system, right? And so I think NERC's guidance is you need a system, right? Take advantage of the best qualities of various sources, right? And if you believe that, then there's another reason why you would have a nuclear component. Okay. So I think there's lots of reasons why people are now talking about nuclear, right? Or being willing to talk about it. All right, so what are the sort of policy drivers behind this? So I borrowed this slide from Greg Nemeth, who's a faculty here at Wisconsin. If you haven't read his book, it's really, really good. His book was not about nuclear, it was about solar. It's called How Solar Got Cheap. Right? And it's really insightful, and it really helped clarify my thinking. But he goes through this history of how, for when I was young, right? Solar was cute, it was niche, it was always going to be too expensive. And then suddenly the prices started dropping like a rock, right? And he goes through and talks about it's this very clever combination of R&D, right? You're tasking people to build a better technology, but you also use things like renewable portfolio standards to tell the market, we're going to buy a fixed percentage of solar. Go compete for it. Go drive the prices down, right? He also talked about how critical it was to have sort of open borders of technology knowledge, right? It was, in the early days, it was the US R&D system, and then we got bored of it. And then the Japanese picked it up, and then they got bored of it, right? And the Germans picked it up and they started driving the prices down. The Chinese followed, manufacturing, driving the price down. But it was the fact that we were not sort of closed as a scientific system that allowed knowledge to be somewhat diffuse, right? And really help drive these. But in the end, without talking about everything, it's just really, this worked through a combination of thoughtful R&D with goals, thoughtful public policy that drove market competition that drives prices down, right? And so I go back to, what did the nuclear world look like me growing up? It was all R&D, right? And I don't think we get those balances right until the last years. I don't think we've thought a lot about what are the public policy approaches that we need in order to drive the costs down. And there's this ecosystem, right? I mean, this is kind of a cartoon, right? But there's a sense that universities do early R&D, national labs do bigger integrated things that eventually gets pushed to industry. I'll argue, and I'll come back to this in another slide, like in the nuclear world, we haven't even been very thoughtful about how these connect to each other, right? And in the past few years, we're getting more and more money. Congress loves us. For those of you who don't know this, Congress loves us. They're giving us more and more money, right? I mean, if you wonder why Mark Anderson looks like such a rich mogul nowadays, Congress loves us, right? But I don't think we've got a very structured system of thinking about how do we think about early R&D, right? How do we incentivize out of the box thinking so we get new ideas? How do we drive that towards development, deployment, commercial deployment? I find this really interesting. So EPRI did this study a few years ago, and what they wanted to do was look at all the demos that we had built, different reactor types in the early days of nuclear. And they looked at how long did certain plants last versus how much the government funded, right? And you'll see that in the cases where the government paid a lot of the cost, they didn't end up going commercial, right? In the cases where the government paid less, it did, right? And I realize this is a little bit of simplification and it's complicated because the Navy developed PWRs and BWRs, but in general, the lack of commercial participation does correlate with never becoming commercial, right? And one of the reasons I get excited about the fact that we've got on the order of 50 advanced reactor companies is because I think they have an incentive to commercialize, right? As researchers, our incentive is to go drive towards perfect knowledge, and theirs is to drive towards a product that's acceptable that you can make money, right? And so I think this is really important. So I think this whole thing about how we incentivize the nuclear system broadly, how we use federal resources, has got to change beyond R&D. Right? This was the real eye opener for me. So NEI, the Nuclear Energy Institute, it's the trade organization for the light water reactors, commissioned a study, and they asked this NGO to go back and look at 65 years of spending from the federal government and to divide it up by what did we spend on oil, what did we spend on natural gas, coal, et cetera. Right? And most people are, the first thing they want to do is like, how much is my favorite thing getting? But to me, that wasn't the most insightful or impactful part. They also divided it up into these categories: tax policy, regulation, R&D, market activity. So I think of market activity as things like portfolio standards. And if you look right away, things that have a lot of like blue and this yellowish brownish thing are the ones that make it to commercial deployment. The ones, nuclear, that are like all R&D, right, are the ones where we didn't develop a next generation of commercial product, right? So for 65 years, we have treated nuclear as an R&D problem, whereas everyone else treats it like Greg Nemeth says we should, right, which is this combination of R&D and I'll call it incentives to commercialization, right? And it's not until the last few years that I think we've gotten this.
What's disbursement? What's the green?
Disbursements, I think these are like direct payments. I have to remember.
And this,
a grant, like a direct grant of some sort.
and this isn't, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the other thing it doesn't have on the list is production tax credits.
Well, I think they would fall in tax policy.
So that money sits in there.
Yeah, so I think there may be in here a very small sliver, right? Because we do have some.
Okay.
It just doesn't, it's not big enough to show up.
So tax policy would be the.
We don't have any production tax credits that have ever been paid out before May 2017.
Correct. Yeah, right, yeah, that's a good thing.
Or yet, for that matter.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the nuclear disbursement is negative because it's NRC.
That,
I wonder if that's like NRC licensing fee.
it is. So this is the percentage that the utilities have to put into the nuclear waste fund.
Oh, okay, the
Yeah,
waste fund.
no one else has a similar construct. So we're the only ones that give back. Yeah. Okay, so that, I think that's really interesting. And I just read about this interesting. And so this is a fascinating case of why policy matters. So I just read this article like a month ago. So the Seabrook nuclear power plant is in this really interesting position, right? Where they want to supply electricity, right, to Massachusetts. At the same time, there are organizations that want to build transmission lines from the hydro plants in Canada down, right? And Seabrook is in the position of both supporting and fighting the exact same law, okay? Right now, they are not eligible for the same tax credits that the renewable transmission people can get. So they want to fight this law because they feel the system is unfair. They feel they're a zero carbon resource, and this hydro transmission combination in policy space is a disadvantage. So they're fighting. Well, simultaneously, they want in on the same deal, right? And so as I read this article, they were both for and against the same thing and fighting them both at the same time. But it's a clear case of where public policy choices, right, make a huge difference, right, in what we decide to deploy. Right? And I don't think up until recently, we've been super thoughtful about that in nuclear space. So starting around 2015, 2016, I say we've seen this pivot, I'll call it the pivot, the policy space, where suddenly we started treating things different. So in research space, we started to create these mechanisms that would allow these private companies access to the research infrastructure. So we created something called GAIN, that was first, Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. The point was, allow these companies access to the national lab facilities. We've now since done something called NRIC. This is to provide deployment assistance, deployment sites. So we're doing things in the research space to make the research infrastructure available. We started passing legislation. NEMA and NECA were two bills that aimed at modernizing infrastructure and modernizing the regulatory approach. ARDP stands for Advanced Reactor Deployment Program. So the government is cost sharing at varying levels. I'll explain this in a second. Companies, as they get closer to commercial deployment. There's a lot of non-governmental organizations that are advocating for nuclear in federal policy space and sometimes in state policy space. This didn't used to be the case, right? But they're actively there, many cases driven by climate change, pushing for legislation. And then even in education and advocacy, you see some interesting things. So Nuclear Reimagined, something my colleague Susie Burns created, which Susie Baker created when she was at Third Way. It's just these images. I used one, right? When I showed you the microreactor image of this little glass dome in Alaska, right? Everyone uses those images, right? But the powerful point I think of this is it allows people to picture a different world, right? Where nuclear might make sense. Rachel Slaybaugh, who had been up to Berkeley until recently, created a nuclear engineering boot camp. Let's get people thinking about entrepreneurship in terms of nuclear deployments, right? So all these things started happening, right? And I think it's a very different space than we were in a while ago. On the Advanced Reactor Deployment Program, I like the way it's structured. It basically says we've got a couple of concepts, the Natrium reactor, which is TerraPower, Bill Gates, and the XE100, which is X Energy. They're getting the biggest cost share from the government. The government's asking them to deploy their demos by the end of this decade. Come down a little bit. The government's saying there's a set of these that we like, but we don't think they're as close to deployment. So we're gonna cost share at a lower level. They call that risk reduction. Then they had even a lower set. Okay? I like this structure. It could be that a year from now I will tell you that I hate this structure.
Yeah.
Right? Because I like the fact that you're willing to place different value on different states of readiness. I worry that this is locked in, right? That if one of these companies in the middle, right, is just horrible and doesn't make progress, that we don't have a way of either kicking them out or moving them down, right? I believe that we should treat the ARDP like the Premier League treats soccer teams, where you've got relegation, and if you don't perform well, you're booted down to the next level, right? I worry we'll lock in for 7 years and not base these on performance, right? So it could be a very good structure, right? Or it could be that we just lock ourselves in to long-term 7-year relationships without being very thoughtful about it.
So can I ask a question right there? So it's my understanding under the new law for the infrastructure that the first two demos are not going to be part of nuclear energy anymore. They will be part of this Office of Clean blah, blah,
Energy
blah,
demonstrations, I think it's called.
which is essentially not tech, which is, I'll call it technology neutral. It's not just nuclear. It's a whole bunch of demo.
Correct, absolutely. Yep. But that's my other question. Is like, so if XE100, right? I have not seen the detailed contract between XE100 and TV. So, but I have heard that they didn't use a milestone approach, right? There's a 7-year agreement, and they're not, unlike the NASA SpaceX progression where they had to meet certain milestones to get paid. I understand that's not the case. But one of the things I like about the Clean Energy Demonstration Office is when you get to that level, it's a bunch of people who are just good at deploying, do big project management, right?
In the clean demo.
In theory, that's what you do. You hire a bunch of people to do big project management. My worry though is if there's no way for that office to kick it back to research, if they're not making progress, that we somehow, they get stuck, right? There's this bifurcation. And once you're in that top level, you're there. And it also makes it harder for somebody down here. Let's say one of these ones just kicks ass, right? They're doing better than you imagine. Like there's no way to.
Have they picked an administrator for that office?
All right, I haven't seen any. Have you seen?
I've only heard names, but my understanding is they haven't picked anybody.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
Following up on this, how do you decide that? So, I mean, you put an administrator there, but
Well, see,
how do you do what you want to do?
yeah, so that's why I think they needed milestones, right?
Yeah.
That's the way NASA did it, right? With SpaceX, they said, okay, you have to do this by this time. If you don't, we're not paying you, right? Whereas here, it's kind of like we owe cost share 20%. And there doesn't appear that I can tell to be milestones where you would actually cut somebody off. But you have to write that into the contract when you set it up. I think that it works for NASA, right? We've got all these, private companies shooting people into space.
How many of these have signed their contracts?
I think they all have at this point.
No, my understanding is BWXT hasn't signed
Oh, they
up,
haven't yet? Okay.
and GA just signed up a month ago.
Oh, okay.
GA isn't even that. other-
Well, they're way down there. Concept development.
So then is it too late? Have we already screwed up?
Well, I would say yes. Well, okay, I would say notionally yes, because it could be that they've done this and I just don't know. Because they're like private contracts, I can't. But I can find nothing that tells me that they used a milestone approach. Someone told me, but I haven't been able to prove it, that DOE thinks it's not allowed to. Right? That
For both of the two big ones?
yeah, that they're not allowed to do milestone. Somebody
Really?
told me that. Yeah. I forgot, but I haven't been able to, I mean, I can't prove it, right? I don't have any insider knowledge. But yeah, so to your point, like, I think we missed an opportunity, we potentially missed an opportunity.
But if I might, I'm sorry, but it's the whole office that may not have milestones. It's not just these two demos.
Well, the whole office hasn't necessarily started all of its work yet,
Yeah, correct.
But this is two of many.
but I think that most of the work that office will do has not been bid or contracted yet.
Yeah.
Has not yet been bid or contracted.
Oh, really?
Right.
The new office that's got new infrastructure money to go do these things.
Yeah.
And these are the only
These
two,
things-
they inherited these.
They inherited these, right? So the rules, right, this office will get whatever any negotiated. Regardless of what their philosophy is going to be.
And any will send some staffing, some technical expertise will go from any on, will be seconded to this office to provide technical input, but
So let me ask the impolite question. Is there any technical expertise in DOE nuclear to send to them?
That's a very good,
Because
it's not
I
super
mean,
deep.
what you brought up about not having milestones, I did not hear, but I had heard rumors that they would not release what the contract was for various reasons.
Yeah.
And this really surprises me because this could be a disaster waiting to happen.
Correct. It could be that there's like extreme brilliance behind all this and I'm just not aware of it. But
Occam's razor.
yeah.
Well, I've seen the milestone chart for GA and I've seen the milestone chart that's put in for BWXT, and there are milestones with dates. So that really surprises me about.
Yeah. And as I said, they may be there, but I have not
But
heard.
I think in Atrium they have.
Do they?
I mean, they may have milestones, whether they're contractually
Yeah,
required
that's
to
the
meet the
question, right?
milestones.
Are they cut off, right? Or are they like, oh, we'll reset the date?
Can I see your argument more in the risk reduction and the concept development versus the demonstration, just because, I mean, it takes a while to ramp these things up, and 7 years isn't that long if you're gonna do a demonstration.
Right.
So how do you know if it's gonna go forward or not? That would to me, that'd be a hard decision to make, whether you.
Well, but I guess I'd think of it like if I was a private investor, right? And I set this out and I said, 7 years from now, you're gonna demo. And 2 years in, you're like, you don't have supply chain contracts set up. You don't have a concrete vendor. I mean, I'd be like, I'm getting my money out of this because you're not making progress, right? And I'm not sure if that's possible, the way they set the contracts.
The only example, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to, but the only example where DOE actually had teeth into their contract was with the B&W, the M-Power design. Because they could not proceed and they did not get their milestones, and DOE pulled out and got money back.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's when the switch was between M-Power and NuScale.
Right. Yeah. So the big picture, at least in my mind, is I don't think we're very thoughtful about how we do everything from early R&D all the way up to deployment, right? As an example, build and maintain infrastructure. Right now, when you ask somebody what's infrastructure, they'll say, oh, it's a reactor, it's a hot cell. right? I don't know why data is not part of infrastructure. Right? I've seen so many cases where we'll do a research program, we'll save a bunch of data, we'll terminate the program, we'll forget who has the data, right? I think we should treat our educational institutes as part of infrastructure, right? I don't think we think of it that way. I think on Discover and Innovate, I don't think we really give people the opportunity to do this, right? All of you that write grants to NEP, they've become a lot, slightly better the last couple of years, but there's a lot of task statements, not here's the problem, tell me how you solve it. And so it doesn't allow you to do grant things. I think the insistence on peer review as the only way to fund things means we're never going to be very creative, because you ask people who have a very strong opinion about stuff to be the gatekeepers from who else gets in. And I don't think we've got very structured ways to move things to the next level, right? And I'll use the university program as an example. Your grant ends at 3 years. It has nothing to do with whether you're successful, right? And there is no real way for anyone to evaluate your progress and say, we're going to spend more time on this, right? I mean, I can't understand how anyone who's run DOE&E thinks they could defend themselves to Congress when the congressperson says, well, we've spent $500 million now over 10 years, and you don't actually have a process for evaluating any of these projects for the next level. And you go, yeah, that's the program. More stars on the map. I mean, it's really good. Anyway, so I think we're not being very thoughtful here, right? And I think the last thing I'm going to talk about just shortly is this idea of societal acceptance, right? Community acceptance, right? We don't think about that very strongly at any of these levels. If we do, it's more typically at the deployment, right? Okay, we're gonna go deploy something, and it's typically we've already designed it, we've already built it, we've already picked out the land. Let's go try and defend it, right? Whereas in reality, you ought to be thinking about how people will respond to the design in the early stage, right? I mean, part of the reason why we love our iPhones is because Apple is so thoughtful about what they look like and what they do, right? As compared to a BlackBerry, which is just freaking weird. You couldn't even do your fantasy baseball on a BlackBerry. I don't know why people don't. All right. Last thing I'll talk about is social license, right? So I think nuclear has this, it's in this unique world, right? Where a lot of people, especially sort of my age people, right, are just nervous about it, right? But recognize the environment they grew up in. And there was a point in time where A, we're saying, hey, this technology can do a lot of interesting things for you. B, build a bomb shelter and have your kids practice getting under the desk as part of school age things, right? Very sort of mixed messaging. I think nuclear was the first thing people ever heard about nuclear was weapons, probably in that day. And so for certain people, there's just a certain amount of dread, right? That comes with the word nuclear. And typically they've never worked with it, worked close to it. They don't really know, right? But there's a dread that does influence their behaviors. And it was all imbued through popular culture, right? This is an example of a typical 1950s movie, and it's got all the images, right? So this giant spider was created because technologists lost control, right? Godzilla was another one, right? Technologists lost control and created this thing, right? And the lady in the hat is society, right? That's the one that needs to be protected. And the dude with the gun, right, is typically an anti-nuclear organization or somebody, right, that's going to protect society from the technologists, right, who can't control the things that they do. And this is viewed through like lots of, just look at half the things that were created in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Like if you needed a creature, just radiation, right? Radiation, okay, sure, why not? And there's also sort of the way we've approached talking about the technology. So I'm sort of like, these are highlights of things where like light bulbs went off in my head, but I got invited to this thing called the Advanced Energy 2016. This is state of New York. They're talking about clean energy deployment, you know, and I'm listening to the plenary sessions and I'm writing down the way they talked about their planned transition to renewables and distributed generation. And it's like, we're going to transform, but we're going to protect people. We're going to protect jobs. We're going to get all these great ideas out of our university community, right? It's participatory. We're going to have wave after wave of demos. We're going to try things. Communities will lead. Everyone will participate. There's resilience, right? Customers matter. Think big. Start, right? This is the way they were talking about their technology, right? And around the world, like lots of people are very excited about renewables, right? And then I think about like, what were the talks I heard as a nuclear engineer? And it's kind of like somebody get up and they're like, okay, Here's all the production things. Here's the deaths, right? We're not as bad. Like, this is the message. We kill less people than you think. Like, why is that a good thing, right? It's, and so I think it gets to this, well, but you know, as a technology, like, but we don't kill you. Like, it doesn't matter, right? It's not where people are responding to, right? They need to say, like, what's the value? What's the risk? What's the benefit to me? How does it fit into my community story? And I think, just like I don't think that we've been good about involving economists and policymakers and things, I think this intersection of social and technical is another big hole in our approach, right? I honestly think that a lot of the renewables deployers are believing too much of their own story. And you're starting to see, as they deploy things a lot, they're getting pushback, right? Because they're not thoughtful about, if you take the same windmill farm in the state of Michigan, and you say, I'm gonna put it on this farmer's field, that farmer may say, absolutely, right? I can farm around it. It will help with all the crazy swings in crop prices. It will smooth my life. Take that exact same thing and put it in another part of the state of Michigan, where people have primarily moved there to build a cabin for the aesthetic views and the getting away, and they will fight you to the death, right? Because you didn't understand their community values and what mattered to them. And I think this, if we're going to think about microreactors and deploying these things everywhere, we've got to be much more thoughtful about sort of the social license piece of this. And I think we're just barely getting around to it. I will say there's lots of things that at one point were super controversial, and it wasn't clear that they were going to be commercial products. And you look at some of these now and you're like, really? Right? But coffee, when it was introduced, was extremely controversial in the Midwest. Mechanized farming is, you know, was this better than horses? Electricity, printing press, margarine, mechanized refrigeration, right? There was a point in time where we hauled ice all over the country, and there were arguments about, but it's better to cool your food with ice because it's natural, right? And this mechanized refrigeration will change the property. I mean, you look at this now and you're like, really? Like some big dirty block of ice, like hauled over by a horse is better than, and you'd be like, it's crazy, right? But at one point this was a real argument, right? And like, we're at the first generation, we're at the turnover of the first generation of nuclear, right? Power technology can last a long time. Right? So it's an opportunity, but you don't always come out as one that people accept, right? So get back to, we need to be sort of more thoughtful about the social parts of this. In some cases, people are saying you need nuclear for the future, right? And these are just examples I found. Nature Conservancy, right? Their whole thing is protect land as a way to protect the environment. They said if you're going to get to zero carbon, you need a nuclear component. Google has said that. Even the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is not a big fan of nuclear, has at least said don't shut down the existing plants too early, right? Make sure you're not replacing zero carbon with a coal plant. So I do think to a certain extent, right, people are coming to this conversation the way they did, right? But it's sort of our opportunity to either do right or not. The dude in the hat, right, in that picture, it was James Arness. You're all too young to know who James Arness is, except for
Just say Gunsmoke.
Yeah, Gunsmoke, right? He got famous for being a cowboy, right, and running in and saving the day, right? So I mean, the message is that we can be our own James Arness, right? We just have to realize, right, that there are lots of things that will matter in deploying it, and part of it's technology, right? But part of it's technology, part of it's cost of the technology, part of it's the social acceptance of the technology, and part of it's the public policy approaches that we use to help determine some of those things. The last thing I'll say is this. I mentioned this pivot, right? That I think starting around 2015, about 5 years ago, I see this major change, right, in the federal government. And they are very supportive of nuclear in a bipartisan, bicameral way. And I was going through my mind saying, well, what was different in that time period? How can I capture that all in a single image? And in the end, I settled on this, which is an incredible amount of talented women were part of this. And if we don't figure out how to bring more people into this field, right, then we're missing out on a lot of important voices. So I think, you know, you hear about diversity. I think it matters, right? And I think we have to just bring people into this field if we're going to be successful. And I think that's my last thing. Yeah, I'm glad to answer any questions you have or chat about this. Yeah, Mark.
So you didn't really talk about the regulations. So you don't think that's part of it? Or to me, it seems like that's a big hurdle.
I do, right? But I think it's a hurdle that we more know how to do than we don't, right? Like we know what the arguments are, and we'll push on NRC, and they'll try to adjust. And I think it's a big deal. right? Because you're asking them to regulate more than one thing. But I guess I'm not as, I believe that the nuclear community will not stop pushing on that one, right? And people recognize that's a big challenge, right? And so I think it's something that won't be ignored. So I don't get as nervous about it, although I do recognize it is a big difference for the NRC.
But does that go into the cost of these things too? I mean,
Sure, right?
the cost of nuclear power is high because it's so regulated. In my opinion.
Well, partly, right? I mean,
I mean, I gotta buy a pump that's the Section 3, I gotta do all this stuff, I gotta have people on site. And all of this goes into the economics of the reactor.
That's what, but I think that's why you see a lot of the new designs trying to take as little of it to be safety related. That reduces it. So it's commercial quality, commercially qualified versus NQA qualified.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the potential advantages of not insisting that every reactor is a giant light water reactor is you have this possibility of reducing the complexity and the number of parts and the things that have to go through that system, right? I think that we incentivize people to build these big systems, which are harder to regulate. They're it's still low probability, but they're more likely to have a big catastrophic failure because it's usually complexity, right? Something happened that people didn't anticipate, right? And so I guess the reason I don't worry as much about that is the regulatory part, the simplification part. It's something that our community is good at thinking about, and people will naturally push on it, right, and try to improve it, drive the costs down. I don't think we've been very engaged in public policy or social stuff. I mean, if you look at all the social, I didn't bring that particular slide. It's about 5 years old. Somebody did a study of like foundations and where they spend money. Right? And if you look at funding spent on nuclear, just anything, it's all nuclear security, nuclear safeguards, right? There are no foundations out there funding, or very, very small, that are funding like just public policy approaches or technology or anything have to do with fission, right? And I think that somehow changing that dynamic is a bigger hurdle to me than the regulatory. Not that it's not important, it's just something we're used to doing.
I also worry that like complaining about regulation is a good way to just not do anything. It's just a scapegoat that, right, that it just sort of gives you this license to blame somebody else for everything rather than fixing the things that you have control over.
Right, but I mean, that's tied to the politics too, so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we should complain it, but I mean, we have to figure out how to deal with it.
It takes time. But I mean, if the best example that at least the most recent good example is NuScale. They planned for a 3-year certification process. And they responded to all questions asked by an overwhelming bits of engineering analysis. And they got through in their 36 months. Now they're coming back and they're improving their design. They're coming in for what I'll call a power up rate. But in some sense, they were able to do it because they knew how to do it going in. They also hired a bunch of former regulators in their regulatory branch, so they knew exactly how to approach the process.
Right, but that's a huge cost. So if I go out and I build PE, I can put those up anywhere I want to. I can stick them on my house. I don't have to call a regulator and so forth. So what I'm saying, like PE,
Solar.
photovoltaic, solar, wind.
My condo association won't let PV in because it degrades the price of the condo. So we wanted to put one up and the other 59 owners said, go to hell.
Yeah, and that's I mean, I think there's this time delay, right? I mean, I think that right now, I mean, you may think we've built a lot of renewables because you like drive through certain parts of the countries and there's windmills everywhere. Like if you compare the amount you would need to how much fossil fuels we're still using, like we've barely scratched the surface. And I really think that we can say, oh, well, regulation is holding us back. But we've got like a 40-year history of building up a relationship with a regulator. And I just think that some of the approaches on the renewable side feel to me a little bit like I'm going to make my money now before it gets hard, right? Because it's gonna be, like, this is an example, right, where people start to push back for whatever reason.
Well, we have Professor Engelstad who's suing the Public Service Commission because they're trying to put 300 megawatts of PV over in Cambridge and she doesn't like it. I mean, as a local example, which I read in the Wisconsin State Journal, I was like, I know her.
Cool, thanks for coming, appreciate it.